Thank you so much, Millie. Even though my body feels fatigued from being whacked out sick this past week with the flu, my soul feels invigorated, so I really appreciate it. And, you know, it's kind of probably somewhat apropos that I've been feeling ill, because today's talk, in a way, is primarily about overcoming. You know, how we show up when there are challenges in our lives, how we show up when, you know, circumstances are not necessarily ideal. And I was home with a fever for several days this past week, so just kind of overcoming or coming over that hump. But I really wanted to be here today because today is actually one of my, say, 2 or 3 favorite services that we do here in Unity, my favorite rituals. The reason is, even though the white stone is a really simple ritual, for me, it's one of the most powerful and transformative rituals that we do. And for me, it is a cornerstone to the rest of the year. And when we gather together at the beginning of every year, we don't just gather together with the folks sitting here in this room, but we gather together with the entirety of the Unity and New Thought movement worldwide that is birthing a different kind of spirituality and community in this world. And so when we gather here at the beginning of the year, I invite us all to consider the expanse of that energy with which we connect here, if not in body, clearly in spirit. And so it's with that I invite us to join. And it's not even that we join together with a body of people doing this service at the beginning of a new year throughout the globe. We also join in a way with history, with decades, years, centuries of overcoming, because this white stone service that we're about to gather to do today stems from ancient times. And it stems from the time of Jesus and the Roman Empire. In those days, some of you might know this, historically in those days, when a prisoner had fulfilled their time and was ready to be set free, as the prisoner is getting ready to leave, that prisoner is handed a white stone as a symbol of that person's freedom, to distinguish from prisoners who merely escaped, if you will, right? Freedom. And of course, it makes sense that over time, this white stone would come to represent new beginnings, a clean slate. And the thing about this, the promise spiritually, the reason this isn't just sort of a ceremony that is based in the secular, but is spiritually based, comes from the final book in the Bible, the book of Revelations, which tells us essentially this, that for you who overcome, or conquers is another translation, for you who conquers or overcomes, I will give you, says Spirit, I will give you a white stone with a new name written on it that is intended just for you. It's a private matter between Spirit and you. And so from the book of Revelations, we get more than the story of overcoming, which is the story of humanity, all our lives in some way. But what we get also is a promise that in the midst And at the moment of our overcoming, there is a promise of new life for us. And so it is so typical, at the beginning of a year, to be very focused on, what do I want to get done this year? What are my resolutions and my goals? What didn't I do last year that I'm going to set my focus and intention on here? And that's very important. It's important for us to have vision and to focus on the future. But my invitation is this, that sometimes what happens at the beginning of the year is that, in a way, we get ahead of ourselves. We get ahead of ourselves and we fail to adequately get behind ourselves. For me, primarily, the White Stone service that we're about to do here today is an opportunity for us to kind of take a step back before we launch so fully into all of that future thinking and get behind ourselves. So I'll share 2 brief points before we open into an extended meditation for the White Stone. The first point that I want to share with all of you is that the way we can get behind ourselves for this year is to look at that passage in Revelation and consider, what have you, what have I, what have we overcome? What have we overcome? What in 2017, what challenges in your life did you conquer? Did you overcome? Let's not just jump to what you didn't get and didn't do, but to focus and be present to that and sit with that for a moment. And then second, I'll invite all of us to consider the meaning and value of this new name, as it's called. How is it for you? What is it for? Why do we do it? And so it's these 2 points that I want to share briefly before, again, we enter into a slightly longer than usual meditation today. First, let's talk about overcoming. As ministers, Sandra, Duke, and I, of course, know each of you more in a deep way, in the ways that are about the things that matter most to you, and the things that you struggle with the most. And we know that sitting here, just in this congregation, is a story, many stories, about overcoming a diagnosis or illness, right? I know my own mother-in-law, I don't know if you heard the news, but a year and a half ago, I mentioned she was diagnosed with breast cancer. Well, last year, she found that she is cancer-free, and she's in her 70s, and she went through chemo. That's a story of overcoming illness. Some of us are overcoming it. And for some of us, the overcoming of illness might not be at all about the fact that this physical ailment has been cured or changed, right? But that we have found peace and healing in our hearts around the state of our own bodies. That we have found some peace and healing in our own hearts, that we have overcome in that way the temptation to blame or criticize or show up any less for life. In this way, many of us have overcome in the midst of physical illness. And then many of us in this congregation, with the ways that we open our doors here to 12-step programs, have overcome overcome addiction. Addiction and relapse. I'm going to grab some water real quick here. And some of us the flu, and some of us are still overcoming it. But really, this is the story of our lives. You know, you don't show up after, but there's this overcoming. And so many of us, there are some of you I know who have just come to understand that you need help and have started the year with this monumental leap into starting a program of recovery for yourself. And for some of you, when I talked about relapse, sometimes it can be the biggest kind of overcoming, right? To overcome the shame of having fallen off the wagon, to be public with your friends about it, have them know, and to go back into those 12-step rooms. Another story of overcoming. Some of us are overcoming life transitions, the loss of a loved one, and the feelings of grief that can overwhelm us. Some of us, in terms of life transitions, are overcoming job changes, job losses, divorce or separation. Some of our life transitions include your children moving out, empty nest, and others, it's children moving back in, right? And that's a big overcoming of the way we need to show up in a different way, pretty much in a whole paradigm way. So the theme of overcoming is again present to all of us. And I invite you to consider this today because I know that some of you are very conscious of this identity. I am a survivor. I have overcome so much abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse. Some of you have overcome stereotypes, bias, racism. Some of you have overcome norms and societal norms that demand that you act a certain way. I've seen men who have grown so much who are saying, you know what, society taught me not to be in my heart. But my overcoming has been about saying no to those standards for men and to learning to live more from my own heart space. To not think that crying is weak, but rather is a natural part of my whole humanity. I know for me personally, addiction has been something in my story. Relapse has been in my story. Overcoming those things. And I invite you to consider as you reflect. I might have brought up some things from your past. I would invite you to not limit what you're considering right now to this past year. Because for some of us, when we arrive here in conscious community, we come to realize that we dismissed our own overcoming in the past. We dismissed the ways that we were survivors in the past. And this is the time to come into your own in that regard and not compare yourself to others. Some of us dismiss because we think, hey, my life wasn't relatively as bad as the guy next door, and so you dismiss your own suffering and your own courage. But I invite you not to compare at all, but look in your own heart, because you know that even if this thing was not hard for someone else, it was difficult for you to show up in that way. Public speaking, for me, I was terrified for most of my life. Overcoming. What have you overcome? I invite you, as we open the year, to hold the power of that, knowing in your own heart, as you open to the idea of the promise stated in Revelations that for you who overcome, you will be given a new name. So let's talk about that name briefly. By a new name, what we mean is a spiritual name. This is a name that reflects a quality of God. It is new to your present consciousness or embodiment, but ancient. It's something already within you, a quality, but perhaps you don't fully recognize that you have it. But throughout this year, for those of you who write that word on the stone, you will come to see how your life opportunities this year enable you to reveal that spiritual nature of yours, that quality that you have. And historically, in the Bible, we see that new names are always given after someone has conquered material consciousness and opened more fully into spiritual realization. Abram became Abraham after he demonstrated great faith. And Abraham means the father of many nations, right? We see Saul, who was a zealot pursuing Christians. On the road to Damascus, he has a spiritual awakening that literally brings him to his knees. And after that, he then becomes Christian and becomes one of the most famous apostles after that. And his new name, Paul, Saul to Paul, Paul means little or diminished. So I might interpret that as humility. He who was zealous for his own way becomes humble before God, and then ironically, through that, is bigger, more powerful, more effective in his life. And of course, Buddha was Siddhartha Gautama, named Siddhartha Gautama at his birth, and then is named Buddha, which means the enlightened one, after his awakening. And of course, Jesus, his last name was not Christ, right? But Jesus of Nazareth walked this journey, awakened, and the Christ means the anointed one. But we are all anointed from the beginning. This revealing of a name is not to God, not to the universe, not to spirit. It's just to us. And so I invite you now to join me in this time where we can reflect on how, if you imagine yourself like one of those Roman prisoners, and you're just breaking through that challenge that you have overcome, or the many challenges that you overcame in your life, or in this past year, you're out there, and you're given a stone. You're given a stone. What does that stone represent? What does it say on it? It looks blank to our worldly eyes. But as we take time to go into the silence and connect with Spirit, which indwells in us, then we realize that it's not blank at all, that we have the blessing from the promise of Spirit in us that will gift us throughout this year. And so let's do that now as we take our attention all inward collectively in this time of meditation.